We come to our last chapter in this class, and our last chapter in Module 4, and it deals with actually managing change within an organization. Also speaks to an organizational learning environment, something that has become very, very popular and very important for many organizations in the present business environment. And of course, throughout this class, we've talked about many of the issues that organizations face in terms of managing and understanding its people. And oftentimes, these problems, or as we've seen, these opportunities, create or present the challenge for organizations and managers to effect good and sustainable change to lead to better performance and better outcomes. So, in this chapter, we're going to really try to understand change, the need for change, where the motivation for change comes from, how the organization can in fact effect change, and how does that help and promote this type of learning environment that is crucial for most organizations in today's business environment. Think of yourself as an individual. When you are forced to change, those forces or those pressures to change can either come from your environment, from those things or those elements outside of you as an individual, or they can come from yourself, from within you. And so the same thing applies to an organization. There are forces of change, there are pressures, there are influences or motivators to change that occur outside of the organization's boundaries. Those are things in their general or in their more direct environment that motivate or catalyze change within the firm. But change can also occur from inside, from the people that are within the organization looking inwardly and deciding that something has to be done differently to bring about some desired or some new desired outcome. Well, one type of external force that can definitely motivate change, and we've in fact seen some of that already in this class, is demographic characteristics. Things like age, income levels, ethnicity, gender makeup of populations, all of those things can force organizations or can require organizations to change both their internal process, especially when it comes to hiring policies, especially when it comes to employment, recruiting policies and all that, but also how they react and how they present their goods and services to customers. So changes with respect to the diversity of a population, whether that again be age, income, gender, whatever, what have you, that can motivate change within organizations. Technological advancements, of course, the use of the internet. Most companies now use technological advancements to benefit them, to help them to reach greater customers, a greater number of customers, also to improve their efficiency and effectiveness within their organization. Technological changes can definitely motivate and influence an organization to change the way they do business. Customer and market changes. Again, customers are different because of changes in the demography of the population, because of increased knowledge. Now customers have more access to information, and this is a forced organizations to change the way they do business. And also social and political pressure. The influence of social media, also the influence of governments on businesses can play a large role in influencing them to change how they operate. Aside from the external forces, we also have the internal forces. And here you see four examples of internal catalysts to change. And all four happen to be negative issues, problems that arise within the organization. We might have low job satisfaction, low levels of productivity, increased conflict between and among people and groups, and also the advent of strikes. All of those problems, if you will, can in fact motivate change. But change can also be motivated by the need to perhaps improve present performance, the need to actually go beyond our present rate of success. And these are the opportunities that we spoke about before that organizations, managers can try to take advantage of, and that can in fact enforce or that can motivate change. Think about when Steve Jobs comes into Apple. Yes, while they did have a myriad of problems, they weren't necessarily the worst company in the world, but he saw distinct opportunities that Apple could potentially go after, that could potentially exploit, and therefore he was that catalyst to change, for the organization to change the way that they were doing this, focusing solely on computers and looking towards these new marketplaces. And we've seen the success that has come about from going after and exploiting these opportunities. So internal forces can also be problems in the organizations as well as opportunities your people within the organization want to take advantage of. Well, how does change actually happen? What's the process of change? And a guy called Kurt Lewin comes up with this change model, this change process, if you will. He says there's three distinct phases. The first phase is unfreezing. And in the unfreezing phase, you're trying to really motivate, you're trying to initiate change. And the way that you do that is you start disconfirming the usefulness or appropriateness of employees' present behaviors or attitudes. You start getting people uncomfortable in the present way of doing things. Now, you would think that if there was a significant problem or significant threat on the horizon, people would instinctively want to change. They would recognize that this wasn't working, whatever they were doing, or that if they didn't change, they would no longer be able to survive. But the truth is that once we kind of get set into a way of doing things, even if it's not the best way or the most efficient way, or even if we see that there is some kind of external threat on the horizon that's likely to reduce the effectiveness of the way we're doing things, we still would perhaps want to stay with the way we were doing things because we are comfortable. People are comfortable even when their behavior does not bring about positive results. Think about people that stay in bad marriages or stick around in very bad situations of friendships. The reason they do that is not necessarily because they believe that this is the best approach, but because they are rather comfortable and they are in fact uncomfortable with the potential of changing, of doing something differently. So you have to unfreeze before you change. And one of the best ways of unfreezing is kind of using benchmarking. It's a process by which a company compares its performance with that of other companies and then learns how the strongest performing companies achieve their results. It's kind of like an intervention, if you will. You step in and you say, listen, okay, let's see what we're doing and let's see what our competitors are doing in terms of their performance. Now, if we're not where they are, let's kind of go into their organization and find out what they're doing that we're not doing. And that provides employees with a vantage point, with some evidence that they could be doing things differently and be getting better results. So this is a way, again, of disconfirming what you're doing is actually leading to success, as well as making people uncomfortable about their present way of doing things and motivating them to want to do things differently. So benchmarking is a distinctive approach to, again, getting people unfrozen, moving them away from the status quo, the way that they're comfortable, or the ways that they're comfortable in acting, kind of breaking those old habits and getting them ready to change. So before you can change, before you can move, you have to destabilize. And this might speak to some of you who are or have some background in science. You know, when a system, when an element is or compound is stabilized, it's very hard to change it. In order for us to change it, we have to heat it up. And the reason why, once we heat it up, it destabilizes the bonds. The same thing is happening in organizations. We have to heat them up so that we can start the change. Lewin then argues once the organization is unfrozen, once people start accepting that the old way wasn't working, we can now start effecting the change. And in effecting the change, what we do is we provide employees with new information, new models, new processes, new equipment, new technology. You cannot just simply tell people the old way of doing things is bad without giving them some type of information, some type of vision, some type of approach that is going to lead to future success. If you are discarding the old, you have to replace it with the new. And that's what change is about. Giving people a new way of thinking, giving them new types of information, new technology, new equipment, something to actually replace the old way of doing it and lead to the performance that you actually or you use to convince them to change in the first place. Okay, so you can't just tell somebody, you know, using this example, you can't tell somebody, you know what, man, you know what, you're doing these drugs and it's the worst thing for you. You have to replace the drugs with something constructive in their life. Once you discard the old, you have to replace it with the new. Change can be aimed at improvement or growth, or it can focus on solving a problem. Going back again, change doesn't necessarily always have to do with resolving or fixing a problem. It can actually be about exploiting or taking advantage of some new opportunity. And once you, in fact, begin the change process, what you have to do is not only continue it, but at some stage you have to establish it as the new status quo. You have to refreeze, you have to stabilize the change. And in stabilizing the change, you help employees integrate the behavior or attitude into their normal way of doing things. Because when change begins, this is still not normal for most people. This is not the way that they do things. For example, when a drug addict goes into rehabilitation and they're offered drugs and they're doing all these other different activities, it's not normal for them. What's normal for them is the life that they've left. And so you have to not only continue to support and motivate that type of behavior, but you really have to find a way to integrate it into their regular life. Show them how, when you get back into the real world, this will work. That's why I'm always concerned when people go on these crash diets of how effective it's going to be in the long run. Yeah, while you can eat nuts and berries for 30 days, you can only eat nuts and berries for 30 days. Can you really sustain that throughout your life? And so you have to think about practical applications and how can this change be easily assimilated or integrated into the work pattern of the employee. And make sure you give employees a chance to exhibit new behaviors and reinforce that, reward those new behaviors. Make sure that you recognize when they are actually applying the change, and therefore that will help to sustain the change and help to establish the change, as I said, as the new pattern, the new habit of behavior. Well, if you recall when we did chapter 15, we spoke about an organization being part of an open system. And we can also use a system approach when we talk about change. In a system approach, it's assuming that any change, no matter how large and small, has some type of cascading effect on the organization. Because the organization is made up of all these different subsystems, change in any part of the system is likely to have an influence or likely to have some impact on other parts of the organization. The organization is not just some independent or mix of independent entities that never interact. In fact, the entire organization, remember, the definition of organization was a process, or was an entity that was all about coordinating the efforts of multiple resources and people. So that coordination brings about the potential for having this cascading effect. And so we take this big picture approach, not only in terms of the effect within the organization, but the fact that the organization is also influenced by the external environment. So we consider that as well. So how do these multiple systems in the organizations operate and integrate and interact with each other? How does that impact the change process, or change in one part or multiple parts of the organization? That's the system approach. To think big picture. And here's a model of that systems approach. You see the inputs there being things like the mission, the vision, the analysis of the organization. This is basically what motivates the organization to change, what motivates the entire organization's being, the mission, the vision, the analysis of both the external environment as well as the internal. That helps us craft our strategy. And as you recall again from chapter 15, structure follows strategy. Once we have devised our way of doing business, which is essentially what our strategy is, our structure is created to facilitate that strategy, to allow us to implement that strategy. So the strategic plan, along with the mission, the vision, and the external and internal analysis, they all influence, or they're all inputs to what we call the target elements of change. And this is the systems within the organization. Systems such as the organizational arrangement, which has to do with the structure and the policies and the procedures. The people in the organizations, the knowledge, their ability, their attitudes, their motivation, social factors, things like culture and leadership, and also the methods, which is the workflow and the job design. All of those things are potential areas that will require change once the firm itself decides to change its strategy, decides to change how it goes about doing business. And changes in those areas are likely, or hopefully will lead to different outputs, the outputs that the firm actually desires to bring about from the change that it's implementing. Well, if you are ever in a position to actually lead organizational change, there are some steps that you could potentially use in order to have greater likelihood of success. I'm going to just go through a few of these steps as you can see, table 16.1. The first one is to establish a sense of urgency. That really comes from the unfreezing stage. You want people to recognize that something has to be done. Think about, if I ran into a class and everybody was kind of sitting comfortably and I said, listen, there's a fire in the building. That creates a sense of urgency. People now want to get up and they want to move. That's change. Create the guiding coalition. Again, you cannot just tell people, hey, we need you to do something differently. You have to guide them towards where you would like them to be, this guiding coalition, and get people involved in the change. Developing that vision and strategy. Where do you want us to go? Where do you want us to get to? That motivates people. That's likely to influence people. Communicating the change, making sure people understand where we're going to and that there is benefit in that change. Empowering broad-based action, generating short-term wins. This is really important because change process, especially very expansive and complex change processes, normally take a while. And so you will not necessarily see the end results of change immediately. So you have to actually celebrate and reward the short-term wins, the stages that are accompanying that long-term change. Consolidating gains, producing more change, and making sure that you refreeze, you anchor new approaches, and that it becomes a part of the core culture of the organization. Well, while we've been talking about the benefits of change, the reality is that any change, whether it be small or large, oftentimes is accompanied by resistance. And resistance to change here is defined as the emotional or behavioral response to real or imagined work change. And that's again important because resistance to change is a perceptive cognitive process. It happens in the mind of the individual who is facing the change. So it can be actual real change where something is going to happen, or it can be some type of imagined change where I believe that something is happening or something is likely to change, but it really isn't occurring objectively. So resistance to change is that emotional behavior response, and it can be as passive as somebody just saying, I'm not going to try to step in the way of the change. I'm going to be an obstacle, but I'm not really going to kind of support it wholeheartedly. I'm just kind of going to be indifferent. Or it can be severe resistance to change, where somebody's actually trying to sabotage the change, spreading rumors, doing things that actually are a distinct obstacle to the change, to the change process. Resistance to change occurs primarily because of something internal within the person who's facing the change, or actually some type of characteristic about the person in charge of the change. And that can be why people in the workplace resist change. First of all, it could just be a predisposition toward change. Remember, we talked about personality and personality types. We talked about, one dimension, especially the openness to experience. If you're somebody who's very, very uncomfortable with change, your personality is one that just kind of likes things to stay the way they are. They like stability. I'm a little bit like that. Then any kind of change, even small scale change, might bring about some kind of negative response or some kind of resistance. So a predisposition, whether or not you welcome change, or whether or not you have that kind of personality or predisposition that kind of backs away from it. Surprise and fear of the unknown. This is probably one of the biggest causes for resistance to change. People, while they may not be happy where they are, aren't necessarily willing to go somewhere where they do not know what's going to happen. Just think about somebody in a hole. You think, okay, hey, listen, anybody that comes past you, and they throw a rope down, you'll just grab onto it. No, sometimes people might be more comfortable in their hole, even though they don't necessarily like their hole, because they don't know what's out there. Fear of failure. I know how to do this. I know how to use this system. If we change our software, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it successfully. I don't know if we start teaching online classes, if I'm going to be able to do that as well as I do it in class. Loss of status and job security. So now you're telling me we're going to this flat organization, and I'm no longer going to be manager. I'm not no longer to have the title. I may actually lose my job. And again, this can be real or imagined. So, but that fear of that loss of status or even my job can be a serious concern and a huge resistor to change, or cause a huge resistance to change. Say peer pressure. Others in the organization saying, "Listen, we shouldn't support this," might actually make another individual more susceptible to resisting change. And in past success, it's the oxymoron of success, if you will. The fact that it worked before, why should we change? Some other possible reasons for resistance to change: disruption of cultural traditions or group relationships. When people get moved, when structures get changed, people tend to lose friendships. They tend to kind of get disrupted in terms of the way they were doing things. And people don't want that. Again, they're comfortable in their team or group environments. They're comfortable with the way they were doing things, their cultural traditions. So they don't want to see those things get disrupted. Personality conflicts: you're dealing with somebody, a change agent that you might not necessarily get along with, and you may not be able, or they may not be able to influence you because, again, of those differences in personality. You may not agree with them wholeheartedly. You may not want to hear about the changes because your personality and their personality kind of collide. Lack of tact and or poor timing: you have to pick the right time to suggest change, to initiate change. Just like in a relationship, when you want to tell your friend something that may necessarily be somewhat hurtful or may require them to do something differently, you want to pick the right time to do that so that they will be more open to the suggestion, to the information. Leadership style: how are you going to create this change? Are you just going to demand it of people, kind of force it down their throat, or are you going to try to use more transformational leadership, meaning giving them a vision, trying to sell them on the rationale behind the change, as well as kind of invoking the emotional appeal of the change. And the failure to legitimize that change, that has to do with the refreezing. If you don't reinforce the behavior, people will tend to fall back on what they are most comfortable with, the old way of doing things. Well, while some resistance to change cannot actually be overcome, most resistance can in fact be overcome. And the way that you do it is by, one, providing as much information as possible to employees about the change. Again, change can bring about a high level of uncertainty, ambiguity, fear. Giving people information about what's going to happen, how the change is going to occur, and what are the benefits is likely to overcome some of that fear and reduce some of that uncertainty. Inform employees about the rationale for the change. I remember quite clearly we just had a restructuring in the College of Arts and Sciences, and many of my colleagues, including myself, were a little bit concerned about the change, and largely because we weren't really informed about the reason for the change or how the change was actually going to benefit us. Conducting meetings to address employees' concerns, recognizing that if people have a chance to voice their opinion, they will see more procedural justice in the change, are more likely to be committed to it, and providing employees with the opportunity to discuss how the proposed change might affect them. As a manager, you may not have all the information, you may not know how the change will personally affect each employee. You really want to have a chance to talk to them, hear their concerns, and to alleviate some of those concerns if you can. So we're going to shift focus a bit away from change towards this concept of a learning organization. It defines it here as proactively creating, acquiring, and transferring knowledge throughout the organization. Learning organizations see knowledge as the most valuable asset to the organization in terms of trying to create and sustain a competitive advantage. And of course, that knowledge is owned by the individuals in the organization. It comes from the minds of the individuals in the organization, that intellectual and human and social capital we spoke about earlier in the course. And so firms that are all about learning try to find ways to create new ideas, to acquire new ideas, whether that be within the firm or even externally, and then transfer that knowledge to all parts of the organization to help the organization to improve, to take advantage of new opportunities, and to become better, continuously better, as they progress in their operations. Well, a lot of firms want to become learning organizations, but exactly how do you do it? Well, the first thing you do is to build a commitment to learning. And this really has to do a lot with the leadership of the organization, whether or not they are going to be responsible for invoking within themselves as well as within their employees this cultural need to prioritize learning, to have or to create new knowledge, to gain new knowledge, and to use that new knowledge to do things differently relative to what has been done in the past. And so this commitment to learning, continuously learning, and if you don't learn, recognizing that you will become inert and you will probably be passed up by others in your environment, by your competitors. You want to also work to generate ideas with impact. This isn't speaking just simply about daydreaming, but wanting to come up with ideas that are going to make a difference in terms of the organization's performance. So generating ideas with impact, ideas that are going to lead to some greater success. And then once you generate those ideas, you really want to generalize these ideas, meaning that you want to find ways to transfer that knowledge, to get those ideas communicated to the whole organization. In order to do that, you really need to overcome some of the barriers, some of the obstacles that you might find in organizations in terms of both communication as well as in terms of sharing and cooperation. You want to overcome that so that the organization is going to be able to utilize these ideas throughout the entire system. And then lastly, you want to help the organization to unlearn the old mental models. Just like in the unfreezing stage of the change process, you had to make people uncomfortable with their present state of doing things. Here, you also have to ensure that people drop those old way of thinking, remove any kind of bias they may have to the benefits and the advantages of the old way. Essentially, change their mindset. So you have to unlearn before you can relearn. You have to really accept that the old way of doing things was not right, or it was not as effective as the new way of doing things.